Hello everyone. I've just left a status update on the Facebook group British Muslims for Secular Democracy. It's a Facebook group I may have mentioned once or twice before. A group that, broadly speaking, I largely support. I'm not a Muslim, but I support the principles behind the group. It's a group for moderate Muslims, so to speak, and I don't really like labelling people moderate, extremists, whatever, but it's a group for level-headed Muslims to show a sort of support for the principles of secular democracy and support for the principles of secular democracy, but also combating the very real threat from Islamism. Anyway, I'm not really here to talk about the group, but more about some of the posts that I've seen repeatedly on that group. Not by some of the original people I knew on the group, but by people who have joined relatively recently. It's quite a big group, I think over 5,000 members. A very diverse range of supporters, or at least people who comment on the group. Everyone from hardcore atheists to Islamists have been on that group from what I can see. So it's very diverse, sort of let's say there's a diverse range of attention towards it. But in recent posts I've seen a lot of people coming out with let's say tired. A promotion of what I would call Muslim victimhood. Now I want you to please watch this whole video before rushing to judgment. When I say Muslim victimhood, I am not referring this to all Muslim people, but there are a lot of Muslims who do take on a victimhood mentality. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is this massive conspiracy theories being put out there that there's somehow a war on Islam. There absolutely is not a war on Islam. There's no evidence for that. At all. Now, people point out, oh, well, look at all the wars the West has had in Islamic countries. But those wars are not against the countries, and they are not against the religion. Neither George Bush nor Tony Blair ever declared war on Islam. Now, Bush is not the most Shakespearean of orators, let's put it that way. He wasn't. But I don't believe, based on anything he said, that there was a hardcore agenda for a war on Muslim people. For one thing, it's a war the West would never win. How do you defeat 1.5 billion people? So that's just stupid. But secondly, I think it's actually part of propaganda to try and get support for Islamist movements, to try and portray them as the victims instead of, in many cases, the oppressors and those who are actually doing the persecuting. And there is a lot of hypocrisy in this. It's similar to the approach I take to Chinese nationalism. Again, that's a victimhood mentality, and again, it's hypocritical. But in this case, it seems to me that whenever Muslims are doing the persecuting, then there's a very widespread sort of claim of, oh, they're not real Muslims, they can't be Muslims, they're just terrorists, it's not the real people, etc. It's not the real Muslims. And in some cases it's just outright ignored. Now, when you have a situation of Muslims being persecuted, as with, for example, in Bosnia, Srebrenica, then there must be a conspiracy. The West is behind it. And I've argued before that the West is often put on this pedestal where it can't win, but I think it's very dangerous to promote this notion of victimhood, because it leads people into believing they really are victims of a wider conspiracy. Now, I am not saying that there aren't examples where Muslims are suffering in a terrible way, and occasionally that is at Western hands. By Western I mean NATO or NATO allies. I'm not denying that for a second. I'm not. What I'm arguing though is that it's there's no evidence. There's a conspiracy against Muslims. Tony Blair actually enacted legislation to protect Muslims from hate crimes. That hardly sounds like an Islamophobe leader to me. He read the Quran in an effort to understand the religion, and he's frequently said that there's extremists who pervert the faith of Islam. So for people to accuse Tony Blair of waging a war on Islam seems disingenuous to everything he has said. Judge the man based on what he said and on his actions. His actions, in many cases, in Kosovo, he defended Muslims. Now, I'm not here to be a cheerleader for Tony Blair, but I'm using it as an example of where this victimhood mentality comes in. So Muslims that say, like, these Western leaders are waging a war on Islam, they ignore the fact that Clinton and Blair took intervention in Kosovo in order to protect Kosovar Muslims from Serb aggression, and Serbia is a predominantly Christian country. So how does that tie into this conspiracy theory? It doesn't. And I just think that people who promote this victimhood mentality, and I would say the same about any group, it's the same as there are some black individuals who promote a black victimhood mentality even today. And if you dare raise the issue, then you're a hate-filled white racist. I can assure you I'm nothing of the sort. But I just think promoting a victimhood mentality doesn't help whatever group it's supposed to be reflecting some sort of suffering on, i.e. it's promoting this idea that a certain group is being persecuted in a certain way unless there's clear-cut evidence that that is the case. Now, there are specific groups that are persecuted. There's Islamic minority groups, especially in Pakistan, like the Sufis and the Ahmadis, who are persecuted. But to say that Islam is persecuted, that Muslims are persecuted, is just utterly... There's Muslims who are persecuted, but not... And that may be because they're Muslims in some circumstances. But the idea that there's a worldwide or Western-based conspiracy against Muslims is utterly baseless. I just don't buy that at all. There has been a coordinated Western campaign against Islamism, against violent Islamism, that has caused tens of thousands of casualties, killed and wounded. And that's a campaign that's been controversial, but in many ways is understandable. Now, I've mentioned my evolution of thought process in terms of the war on terror, and I don't have time in this video to talk about that, but I just think that those who are promoting this Muslim victimhood agenda, i.e. there's a massive conspiracy against all Muslims, are just making themselves look ridiculous, because if you look at a country like the UK, there's very strong legislation in place which makes it illegal to discriminate against anyone based on their religion, and it makes hate crimes a criminal offence. Hate crime is defined, for example, if someone decides to throw a petrol bomb at a mosque, that person will be arrested. Now, if this was a society that was actively encouraging hate against Muslims or an agenda against Muslims, that would be obvious, but that is not the case. Even the tabloid press, which I have contempt for, even the tabloid press, I remember after 7/7, and this is a bizarre situation where I'm sort of defending a tabloid, and I feel strange doing it, because believe me, I hate the tabloids, but the Daily Express ran a cartoon saying, no martyrs, we are all British here, showing a mosque and loyal British Muslims. The point being that they were actually trying to not encourage Islamophobia. Now, that's a bizarre thing for me to say, because I hate the Daily Express and everything it stands for, but I use that as an example again to show that the idea that there's a sort of war on Muslims is just and people have had the audacity to compare Muslims in Britain today to Jews in Germany in the 30s. It's a vile comparison, and I'll give several reasons why. The Jews in 1930s Germany were not staging actual terror plots, and in some cases terror attacks, as has been the case in Britain with 7/7, with the Glasgow airport attack, with the Exeter attack, and with numerous attempted attacks. You did not have that situation in Germany. In Britain, Muslims are not put into ghettos and forced to wear stars to identify themselves, or, well, let's say crescents. Muslims in Britain are not forced to wear crescents to identify themselves as Muslims. So to make that sort of comparison is absurd, and I have seen it a few times. It just irks me off that when Muslims are doing the persecuting, whether it be through Islamist terror or the persecution that takes place in Islamic majority states, then there's always denials. And this is a huge problem within Islam, in my opinion. Too many level-headed Muslims, too many moderate Muslims, i.e. those who would have nothing to do with Islamists, don't entirely help, because they don't acknowledge that Islamism is a problem within Islam. I think it's a mistake to say Islamism's got nothing to do with Islam. And I made this analogy before. A corrupt police officer is still a police officer. Likewise, a corrupt Muslim is still a Muslim. And not just because they call themselves that, because Islamism sprang from Islam. You can't deny that. It's not just something that's been, people put forward that it's been invented by the CIA. Now, I know the West has played double games. I know that. But Islamism is a very real ideology. And there are people in this world who do want to force Islam on the non-believers. You can't deny that. So I'm just a bit tired of seeing this Muslim victimhood agenda. There are examples of Muslim suffering. There are examples of Muslims being persecuted or suffering discrimination. But the idea that there is a major plot or a huge conspiracy theory cooked up by Western governments, I see no hard evidence for that at all. And if people want to say the war on terror, I would counter that is a war specifically on Al-Qaeda, on the Taliban, on specific Islamist networks. The war on terror has never been a war on Muslims. Now I can understand why there's a perception that it is, because the countries affected have been Islamic states. But in many cases, those acts of intervention were to protect Muslims, i.e. from Taliban oppression, and I think it's just disingenuous to try and make that out to be a war on Muslims. I don't see any evidence for that, because the vast majority of killing in those conflicts, I would add, especially of civilians, especially in Iraq, has been at the hands of various sectarian groups. Now, I always say that the post-war planning of Iraq was a complete catastrophe, and Bush and Blair still have a lot of answering to do in terms of what the real reason for the war was. That I acknowledge. I acknowledge the controversy of it. But what I don't accept is that those actually committing the carnage somehow have no responsibility for what they are doing. So when we hear of the sectarian conflict going on in Iraq today, there is no one to blame for that directly, but those who are planting the bombs. Those people who know what they are doing. Those sectarian thugs who want to slaughter men, women and children because they belong to another sect. So, yes, the US and the UK and coalition countries have blood on their hands, but let's just stop this Muslim victimhood propaganda, because it doesn't stack up to all the evidences available. There is no massive conspiracy. There just isn't.